Having a weather forecast is probably the most important piece of knowledge in Patagonia. Good weather forecasting is probably the most important technological development in climbing in Patagonia because weather is everything in Patagonia. Patagonia is known for some of the worst weather in the world, and without a weather forecast, all you can do is go out and try your best and hope, and you basically just get worked all the time. And with a good weather forecast, you can tailor your objectives to exactly the size of the window. So you can take advantage of really small weather windows. You can take advantage of really big weather windows. You can choose an appropriate sized objective for whatever the conditions are. I had experience climbing with Colin Haley where we were trying to do a multi-day traverse near the Torres, but further north. And we were climbing well. Everything was going well. Conditions were good. But we got a weather forecast that it was going to be a nuclear windstorm later in the day. And we basically didn't want to wind up in a position where we were too exposed. And so we wound up bailing after 2 days of the traverse, I think, when we could have gone for 4 or 5. And as we were bailing and as we were hiking out of the mountains, it seemed silly to be hiking out because, it was nice. And then sure enough, right on cue that evening, we got hit by nuclear winds that actually kind of knocked us to the ground while hiking. And that wasn't even on the peaks. That was on the hike out. And we were like, whoa, thank God we're not on the peaks right now, 5,000 feet higher, getting hit by even harder winds. And that's the
Yeah,
kind of thing that we never could have anticipated without a weather forecast because the
right.
weather was perfect. It was all good. And then the weather just hit us like a freaking bomb. And, that was the case where I was like, I'm glad that we had a friend satellite texting us, telling us that we should bail because the weather was about to be really bad. We're like, okay. And we did. And we wound up avoiding a major character building experience. The weather in Patagonia is incredibly complex. And when people check the weather in Patagonia, what they're generally doing is checking one of 5 different models and then comparing it to the other 5 different models and then comparing it to the models that their friends were and then talking about it for a couple hours and then thinking about it. And so they're evaluating the forecasted level of precipitation and the wind speeds and the pressure and whether or not I mean it gets kind of crazy because you always run into some guy who's like, oh, this is the German naval forecast for the South Pacific and it's showing a high pressure system coming in 2 weeks. And you're like, dude, are you good? I mean, but all the complexity of it aside, it does basically work. I mean, weather forecasting now is way different than it was 20 years ago when there was no weather forecasting.
And those old school stories, like Greg Crouch's book, Enduring Patagonia, is just such a classic. It's so good because Crouch was there during what I've called old Patagonia, which is mostly, I sort of delineated as pre-weather forecast because that's what changed everything, like massively. Old Patagonia, it was a bit of a different deal. Everything changes over time. It's just the way of the world. But those old stories of people going down there and camping out for just months at a time and looking at the stars and trying to come up with theories as to when the good weather's coming, when it's not. They get romanticized, but I think for good reason. There are stories of the wind would lift people off the wall at a hanging belay, and then when the wind stops, drops them back down, they shock load their anchor. Like just horrifying wind. You can't even stand upright on the glacier. Like Estes Park is windy where I live. It's like really windy, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know about wind. Like no, you don't know about wind until you try to deal with it down there. And so imagine, you and your partner just got your asses kicked down there. You barely survived. You make it down. All you want to do is rest and sleep for a while and eat empanadas and all that. And then you get out of your tent one night to take a leak or something, and you look up and the stars are out. Like, oh fuck, what do we do? Do I just go back to sleep and pretend I never saw anything? Don't say anything? Or do you wake up your buddy and be like, come on, we got to go. The stars are out.
And just the fact that there's even internet connections in Chalten now that allow you to access weather forecasts are a huge difference. And so, despite the fact that the weather forecasts themselves are very complicated and hard to interpret, the reality is that as you learn how to interpret them, you basically can be very strategic in your objectives.
Yeah, I feel like it's the only place I've ever really climbed where you like talk about weather in windows, right? Like, because the default is bad. And so if
totally.
It's going to be good, it's like this opening of a window and it starts to like totally dominate the whole vibe in Chalten where you're just like, everyone starts to buzz like, oh, have you seen the
yeah, but probably the underappreciated aspect of weather forecasting is that you can choose the proper objective for the forecast. So if it's going to be cold and overcast, you choose an ice climbing objective. If it's going to be sunny and dry, then you choose a rock climbing objective. Like saying that there's good weather for a day or two doesn't necessarily indicate the quality of the weather for the 2 days. And so you want to choose, if it's been really sunny, then all the ice has melted off some of the features. So you don't want to go ice climbing. But if it's been, overcast all season, then you probably do want to go ice climbing. I mean, weather forecasting and just weather knowledge more generally is probably the most important development in Patagonia.
Well, and I imagine too, you get to carry stuff, potentially carry less stuff if you kind of have an idea of what the weather's going to be, which also lets you go like a little bit faster.
Yeah. So in the past in Patagonia, if you were climbing in the mountains, you would be prepared for anything. You would take ice climbing gear, you would take, full weather gear. You'd be prepared for the worst weather experiences of your life. But now with good weather forecasting, you can cater your gear more specifically to the objective that you're climbing. And you generally have a much better sense of when the window is going to close. And so you can bail out of the mountains sooner. So you can carry lighter loads, be more strategic about your objective. It's just less of a fester in the mountains and more of a surgical strike. It starts to feel more like Yosemite Valley, where you just go climbing on the days that you want. But the thing about weather forecasting in Patagonia and trying to evaluate a weather window is that you really have to nail the weather windows appropriately, because if you hike in a day too early, then you get crushed by a storm before you start climbing. If you hike in a day too late, then you get crushed by a storm while you're trying to do the descent. And so you really have to nail the windows properly. And so that often means that you do the approach in bad conditions, because you know that it'll be good conditions in another day or two when you get there and you're ready to actually do the climb. And so, forecasting is complicated. Patagonia, the weather in Patagonia really is a game that you learn how to play over multiple seasons.
Yeah, but even like hiking in when you know that the weather's going to be good, it like buys you a whole day, because right, like if you're hiking in mediocre weather, but if you have been in town waiting for it to get splitter, then you're like too late.
Yeah, then you're too late. Exactly. And that's the reason that in the past, when people were on Patagonian expeditions, they would camp in the mountains as opposed to in town, right, because they were more poised and ready to climb if the weather ever got good. Yeah. But it's hard to imagine camping in Patagonia for a month underneath the mountain, and then every night just waking up, and if you see stars and the wind isn't howling, just packing your bag and going at 2 a.m, especially because each time you try something like that, probably 70% of the time you get worked by weather and you fail on the objective. And, how do you muster the enthusiasm to try again and again when each time you just get smacked down? It's hard to imagine that level of psych after you've been crushed in a storm 5 times in a row. It's like, it'd be so scary. You'd be like, oh, another day that we have to leave the tent. You're like, why don't we just read books and hang out?
Yeah, now you get to just like go be successful, then go hang out at the chocolateria, and then go back in and be successful again. You're like not using nearly as much energy like on your trip overall.
Yeah, weather forecasting completely changes the game in Patagonia.